You're listening to the Bluffton Biblecast, a podcast designed to accompany you and encourage you as you explore this week's Bible reading. Welcome. Today is Monday, August 1st. I'm Joe Lehman, and I'm here again with Ashley, Doug, and Sarah. And William Fichter is the main guy behind the sound today. We would like to commend you, our listener, for staying faithful to the reading plan through the vacation season. And if you're playing catch up because you're a few weeks behind, we understand completely. Psalm 1 says that the man or woman who meditates on the law of God is blessed. The psalmist says, he or she is like a tree planted by the streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all they do, they prosper.
Well, that's exactly what we're doing this week. We're meditating on the laws Yahweh gave Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai. Monday, we'll be reading Leviticus 21, and Tuesday, Leviticus 22. In these chapters, we will read about how God wanted the priests to be physically and morally pure as they served in their role.
On Wednesday, we start a new section in Leviticus 23. Here, God outlines the various festivals for Israel to celebrate. Later in the episode, Ashley is going to share some of her research into the meanings behind these festivals.
On Thursday, we have Leviticus 24. This chapter touches on several issues, and it is here that we find the famous phrase, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's why on Friday, we'll revisit the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, chapter 5, verses 21 through 48, where Jesus expounds on this phrase as he talks about the law of the new covenant.
As we reflect on what we've studied so far in the Torah, I hope you've noticed how it paves the way and even points a finger directly to Jesus.
Yes, and I've so appreciated how it's given me a greater glimpse into God's character, his desire to be near his people and provide for them in a way they could not provide for themselves.
Exactly, and the festivals are no different. We get to read about them this week in Leviticus 23. When I think about the festival, do you know what I picture, Sarah? Something kind of like the street fair. You know, good food, a lot of people, and a lot of noise. But after looking into Israelites' festivals further, I found out that they served a much deeper purpose and even had a prophetic aspect to them.
You mean they didn't have pineapple whips?
Not exactly. Okay, so here's what I've learned. There are 7 festivals, or feasts as they're called, that are outlined in this chapter. First we have the Passover, then the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, then 3 harvest feasts, the Day of Atonement, and lastly, the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths. Unfortunately, for the sake of time, we won't get into the specifics of how or when the Israelites performed these festivals, but I've chosen 3 to look at more intently. I would encourage you, the reader, to look into the other 4 in your personal reading. What I learned from my studies truly impressed me.
Wow, this sounds pretty exciting. So what 3 feasts are you going to teach us about, Ashley?
Yes, let's jump in and talk about the 3 harvest feasts. The first being the Feast of the First Fruits. This feast celebrated the first fruits of their crop. But incredibly, this fell on the day that years later, Christ was resurrected. I don't think that's a coincidence. Paul refers to Jesus as the first fruits of the dead in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 20. He was the first to rise and to be followed by all who trust in him.
Wow, what a parallel. Okay, Ashley, what harvest feast is next?
The next is the Feast of Weeks, which I learned is also known as Pentecost, which taken literally means 50 days. So Pentecost took place 50 days, or roughly 7 weeks after the Feast of First Fruits. Traditionally, people were expected to bring their first harvest of grain to the Lord, including the leavened loaves of bread. Do you remember what happened at Pentecost?
The Holy Spirit came at Pentecost.
Well, I kind of wanted you to sing that line, but exactly. And the harvest began with 3,000 souls that day. These were the first of many to come as the message spread to both Jew and Gentile, which is represented with those 2 loaves of leavened bread that were brought.
I'm learning so much here. Keep on going.
Well, the last of the harvest feasts is the Feast of Trumpets. Here, God commands his people to rest. All regular work is prohibited, and they present a food offering to God. The feast was commemorated with trumpet blasts, hence the name. And can we think of any other important trumpet blasts?
Christ's return?
Bingo. The day where Christ will come back and we will enter into his rest and have a beautiful wedding what?
Feast. Wow, what a correlation. This is all so incredible when you stop and think about it. So God set up these feasts not only to help the Israelites remember his provision and give him glory, but also to point to Christ generations later. And I'm guessing that because these feasts were such a part of their new God-given identity, it helped them understand what Christ really did for them once their eyes were open to his true purpose.
Exactly. Once they put 2 and 2 together, it would allow them to love God so much more. Like I said earlier, every single one of these feasts points to Christ. This was no coincidence. It was an incredible plan.
Each of the chapters in Leviticus we'll be reading this week began in a similar way, something to the effect of, "Say to the people of Israel." These conversations between God and Moses, and then between Moses and the people, took place at the foot of Mount Sinai as the Hebrews were camped there for a year. So let's call this part of the Torah the conversations on Mount Sinai.
All right, I know where you're going with this, Doug. Why not just come out and say the Sermon on Mount Sinai?
Okay, you read my mind. The Sermon on Mount Sinai. Our New Testament reading this week comes from Matthew chapter 5, which is the beginning of what is referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. It was 1,480 years, almost 1,500 years from the discourse at Sinai to Jesus' sermon at Galilee.
I remember there's something about the law of Moses in the Sermon on the Mount. Didn't he say that he wasn't trying to abolish the law, but that he had come to fulfill it? What did he mean by that?
Yes, that's verse 17 in chapter 5. Keep in mind the 2 greatest commandments in the law are about loving God with all we are and loving our neighbors in the same way that we love ourselves. Over the hundreds of years, Hebrew religious leaders had perverted the laws by misquoting and misapplying them. And when Jesus came into the picture, the law had become a confusing mess of legalistic rules and regulations. Jesus wanted to turn the people's hearts back to the real purpose of the law, which, as we said before, was to prepare for God a holy people able to have fellowship with him. That's the fulfillment of the law.
So can you give us more specific examples from the text?
Yeah, so you'll hear the phrase repeated when Jesus says, "Ye have heard that it hath been said of them of old time." And then he goes ahead and says whatever it was about murder, adultery, or hating enemies, etc. He follows in that booming, solid voice of authority of his, "But I say unto you."
Okay, so in verse 38, it was about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which is from our Leviticus reading. What about getting revenge? What's that about?
Well, that's what the people were taking it. They were trying to get revenge. They were justifying their nastiness there. But God in Leviticus 24:20 includes it so that judges could mete out a fair sentence and make the punishment fit the crime. So in Jesus' sermon, after the people showed fairness and were merciful, they were to add to that forgiveness and love. Followers of Jesus were to turn the other cheek or to go the extra mile. These were new concepts to them.
I'm wondering how Jesus' teaching was accepted in those days.
Well, one of the study Bibles I consulted had this to say. To many Jews of Jesus' day, these statements were offensive. Any Messiah who would turn the other cheek was not the military leader they wanted to lead a revolt against Rome. Jesus was trying to start a revolution, but it wasn't against Rome. It was against the hardness of people's hearts.
Okay, so as we're reading along in this week's plan, I started in Leviticus 21 and going through the first couple verses. I didn't think much, and then bam, came to verses 16 to 21 and stopped in my tracks. Wait, what?
Yeah. This is when God speaks about the outward appearance guidelines for the priests, how there was not to be any blemish in the temple. A priest cannot be blind or lame. They can't have a limb that's too long or be injured in their foot. Many stipulations on this.
I was shocked and honestly disappointed. I mean, I knew, for example, that God had some very specific guidelines for how the tabernacle was to be constructed in Exodus 26, or how throughout the Torah we hear how perfect each animal offering was to be presented. But people? I just couldn't believe it.
I was actually surprised too. Why do you think we had these strong reactions to this?
Well, I've been thinking about it a lot. In this Leviticus text, the word used is defects or blemishes. But when I read it through my cultural lens, all I could think were words like special needs, or those with physical challenges, or those who have different abilities than the majority. I mean, take the current Christian perspective, first of all. We are taught to welcome and include those who have special needs.
Right. We remind ourselves and each other all the time how we are all made in the image of God.
Yes. Yes, and then if we zoom out even more into our American society as a whole, it seems we are always shifting our language and finding ways to be more respectful toward those who have challenges of any kind. So I think these are some of the reasons why these verses in Leviticus make us stop and scratch our heads.
All right. How do you reconcile it all?
Well, it took a little praying and digging. Unfortunately, we don't have time to do a deep dive here, so I'll just wade in a little bit. I listened to an excellent podcast from John Piper, and he put it into perspective for me. So if we think about how God interacts with mankind, there are really two different dimensions. One is overflowing mercy and grace, and the other is unapproachable holiness. If we consider God's holiness, nothing imperfect can approach him. You know, I personally don't have a physical defect, but I still don't qualify to be in God's presence because I am not morally perfect. Every human has an imperfection, which means none of us can be in God's presence.
I have a feeling this is where Jesus comes in.
Yeah, we've said it before and we'll say it again and again, that Jesus made a way for us to approach God's holiness. We are made perfect through Jesus. Hebrews 10:14 says, "For by that one offering he, Jesus, forever made perfect those who are being made holy."
Wow. That is reassuring, isn't it? Not to mention the many stories in the New Testament, how Jesus went out of his way to approach those with leprosy, those who couldn't walk or couldn't see. So, Sarah, did your searching make you feel completely settled about these verses?
Yeah, good question. I do understand it a little better now, and the discomfort I still carry surrounding this text just might not be reconciled this side of heaven, and that's okay. But really, overall, studying Leviticus is doing two things for me. Number one, sobering me to remember the holiness of God. And number two, leading me right to Jesus. So I call that a win-win.
Dear listener, thanks for inviting us into your personal devotion to God's Word this week. We hope that you learned something new and feel encouraged. It was truly our pleasure preparing this week's episode on the Bluffton Biblecast. Let's close with the words God gave Aaron and his sons to say over the people as they annually came and worshiped at the temple in Jerusalem. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. And may the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.